And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Susan Rice, who served President Barack Obama as National Security Advisor.
Thank you, everyone. I love the energy in the room, and best of all, I love having Susan Rice, Ambassador Susan Rice, here. Wow. Woo. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Are you going to disclose our relationship?
In a little bit.
Okay. All right.
It's
only fair.
I wanted first, before they know about our relationship, to ask you about your book, Tough Love, because it's a great book. You all have it, so now you need to read it, and you'll love reading it because she really gives you the inside story. But what I think is so impressive is it's so personal. You said to Michael Morrell in an interview with him that it was even raw. So tell us why it's raw, and tell us why you wrote it.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for doing this. Vicki is the reason that I'm here, and when she discloses our relationship, you'll know why. I wrote Tough Love for many reasons. One, I wanted to share what I had learned through serving two administrations, President Clinton, President Obama, over the course of 16 years. In terms of personal and professional lessons, I wanted to share what I'd learned from my extraordinary parents and grandparents and my upbringing in the 60s and 70s in Washington, D.C. And I really thought that perhaps I might have something of relevance for anybody who was trying to compete and thrive in unforgiving environments. And if they'd been knocked down, as I have a few times, to be able to get back up. But the other reason I wrote it, that was the reason I wrote it. The reason I wrote it now, as opposed to 10 or 15 years from now, is, as many of you will recall, when I was UN ambassador in 2012, I was asked to go on 5 Sunday shows shortly after the terrorist attack in Benghazi that killed our ambassador and my friend Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans, to give our best assessment of what we knew about what had happened at the time. And following that, I'm shorthanding here, I sort of morphed from being a relatively low-profile member of President Obama's cabinet and UN representative into a sort of nationally notorious villain or victim or heroine, depending on what cable channel you watch. And I found myself characterized and mischaracterized and all of that. And so long as I was serving, and I was still happily serving as UN ambassador and later as National Security Advisor, my job was to speak for the United States and the President of the United States, and not for myself. So I had to basically keep my mouth shut and suck it up and let other people say whatever they wanted to say. So when I left government, I thought it was the right time for me to tell my own story in my own words. And the reason it's personal and the reason it's raw is because to do that honestly and authentically, I had to be as frank as I could. I wanted the reader to come away from this, whether you like me, hate me, respect my story, don't respect my story. The one thing I wanted was for people to feel like I had been as forthcoming as I could. And then you make your own judgments. So I talk in pretty plain terms about my parents, about their divorce and how that affected me as a child. I talk about the health challenges that my parents and my kids have had. I talk about my marriage. And I talk about, the particular challenge of living in a family that is very deeply politically divided. I've got a wonderful husband, as you'll see from reading the book. I've got a wonderful daughter who's a 17-year-old high school student who's very progressive, and I have a wonderful son who is a extremely conservative college senior. Indeed, for almost 2 years, he was the president of Stanford College Republicans.
Susan,
And
I have to interrupt.
so I talk about all of that stuff.
I have to interrupt for a minute because when Susan Rice came to the State Department as the Assistant Secretary for Africa, she was the youngest ever 32-year-old Assistant Secretary. She was black, and she was a nursing mother. And this,
Of the conservative. So I blame the State Department for this.
and this young child she was nursing, Jake, at the State Department, turns out to be a conservative.
Yeah, so Vicki and I first, I'm going to tell this story because it's not fair to people.
It'll be better if you tell it.
So I come to the State Department at 32 years old, 3 months into motherhood. And I had served through the prior term of the Clinton administration at the White House on the National Security Council. I started at 28. I was a director on the NSC staff. That's sort of the junior policy level position. I worked on UN affairs and peacekeeping. And then 2 years in, I was promoted to run the Africa office at the NSC. I was the senior director for African affairs. And the counterpart, in effect, to the Assistant Secretary of State. And then when President Clinton was reelected, I was nominated to go to the State Department. And Vicki, who was one of the many very experienced, very professional career Foreign Service officers who were now my colleagues, Vicki was one of my deputy assistant secretaries
And people
very
used
early
to
in my
ask
term.
if Susan was my daughter.
I mean, it was, not to mention awkward, it was challenging because all of my colleagues and senior colleagues and direct reports, all of our ambassadors throughout the African continent, those in the Bureau in Washington, were, in Vicki's case, maybe 20, and in the case of some other people, 30 years my senior. And as is obviously the case in the State Department, more male than not, more white than not. And I was this bizarre, literally breastfeeding mother of a 3-month-old child. And Jake learned to walk in the corridors of the State Department to the horror of the secretaries in the offices on that corridor where the Africa Bureau was. It was just viewed as outrageous that one would bring their young child into the State Department to feed or to do anything else.
It was very good for them, Susan. It was what they needed. But, and you know, the State Department, we can't give the State Department too bad of a rap because it's really taken a lot of knocks.
No, we're big
recent
fans of the
history.
State Department.
But you really proved yourself on not Benghazi, on the, yeah.
What's going on with your mic?
Is this working? Well, we'll just share. So Susan really proved herself on August 7, 1998, when our embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, were blown up by Al-Qaeda. Hundreds were killed. It was a huge crisis, and the person who had to deal with this, the one on the spot, was Susan Rice. And she did an amazing job. She said it was her the most difficult day of your life.
It was the most, I mean, of all of our lives. We were, with Vicki and I and Ambassador Johnny Carson and others, were horrified to be awakened at 4 o'clock in the morning with a call from the State Department Operations Center that was telling us that our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania had been attacked simultaneously by Al-Qaeda. And in Kenya, it was, a scene out of, the seventh circle of hell. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And the losses were extraordinary. We lost more than 12 Americans, over 200 Kenyans, and thousands injured. And that day, that week, those weeks that followed, where we had to account for our losses and try to comfort the families who could, of course, not be comforted, our colleagues, launched the investigation. And the truth is, as I say in the book, and it wasn't really public at the time, it turns out that Al-Qaeda had plans to hit also simultaneously our embassy in Kampala, Uganda. And the only reason they didn't succeed is because the Ugandan authorities thought this truck crossing their border looked suspicious and stopped it. But it was, a horrible, horrible, horrible loss. And I actually, Vicki gives me more credit than I think I deserve. I really felt like it was a place where I made mistakes and had to learn and grow. I mean, I write in the book about how a State Department psychologist comes into my office a couple days after the bombings and, in his very terse and formal way says, you understand your people are very stressed out and suffering. I said, yeah, like no shit. And
He was talking about me.
and he said, well, you've got to take care of them. You've got to do, recognize this. And I basically threw him out of my office and slammed the door because he was giving me nothing useful that I could work with. I knew how stressed we all were, but the only way I knew to manage through that was to just be focused on the mission and drive through it and not, in retrospect, I think is a mistake, not create sufficient space for people to work through what we were all feeling.
But how do you create that space in a crisis? Because it wasn't just the crisis of our embassies being blown up. In addition, it was Africa's world war. And that was the war in Congo following the 2 wars in Rwanda. And 11 African countries were involved. So Susan was managing this as well. And so this is my turn to tell the story. And I didn't tell Susan what the story was going to be. So we'll see what she has to say. So Susan and I are in one of these conference rooms with our State Department colleagues. And then up on the TV is the White House, the embassy in Congo, the Department of Defense, the CIA, and we're all talking about how we're going to evacuate the embassy. Is this beginning to ring a bell? And Susan says, oh, let's take the Tutsis at the embassy of Rwanda with our convoy to go to the airport. And I blurt out, no way, we're not doing that. And there's this silence. Nobody says anything. The meeting ends. I see Mary Ryan, who was one of my mentors, and she says, Vicki, I hope you still have a job. So with great trepidation, I came back to our office, and Susan is there waiting for me, and she hugs me. It's just, it must be my voice.
No.
Oh, okay, there it is.
So
She hugs me. And so what I wanted to tell you is the greatness of spirit that Susan Rice has, and that she showed me that loyalty goes down as well as up. Do you remember that?
I didn't, thank you for recalling that.
You don't remember it.
And I'm sure you were right.
Oh, of course.
I think I was worried about the Foreign Service nationals in our embassy being targeted for their ethnicity. and I wanted to take them out, and you recognized that would put everybody in danger.
No, I think we might have been going to take them out, but it was the Tutsis from the Rwandan embassy, I think. Yeah. Anyway, that was.
Vicki was right, I was wrong, no question.
Well, now I'm beginning to think maybe I didn't hear it right. Anyway, Susan's a fighter, and she got this from her father, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank.
Not a chair, a governor of the Federal Reserve.
Governor, and should have been the chair. Anyway, he told her, don't take crap off anyone.
That was his life lesson. Well, I gotta say, thank you. Yeah, I overlearned that lesson, don't take crap off anybody. But if I'm a fighter, whoever I am is really a product not only of my dad, but also of my mom. I really was blessed, as I try to share at the beginning of the book, to have these extraordinary parents who came from very different backgrounds, but each taught me something extremely powerful. My mother's family my grandparents were immigrants from Jamaica who came to Portland, Maine in 1912 with no education. My grandfather was a janitor until he was 80 years old. My grandmother was a seamstress and a maid. And like so many immigrants, they came to this country to try to give their family a better life. They had 5 kids, and they saved and they scraped and, they borrowed and they sent their 4 sons to college and then on to graduate school. 2 of my uncles became doctors. 1 became an optometrist, and the 4th became an English literature professor and a university president. And then along came my mom, the baby, who was valedictorian of her high school class in Portland, Maine, and a champion national debater and the school president. And she was supposed to go to Radcliffe College, which, as you know, became part of Harvard. And she was denied the scholarship that the state of Maine typically provided to the valedictorian who got into Radcliffe because she was black. This was 1950, and the so-called criteria for the scholarship were that you had to come back to Maine and be able to move in what they called the proper circles in order to raise money for Radcliffe. And because she was black, she couldn't move in the proper circles. Meanwhile, my grandfather, the janitor, had had a catastrophic accident at the music store where he worked. He fell down an elevator shaft, and he shattered his back and he shattered his legs. And so all the savings they had for my mom had been tapped. And so thankfully, my mother's high school principal and debate coach appealed directly to Radcliffe, and they gave her the money to go. And she was magna cum laude. She was one of 3 African-American women in her graduating class of 1954. She was the president of the entire student body at Radcliffe. And because of her experience and that of her brothers, she decided that her life passion was really about expanding access to higher education for low-income Americans of all backgrounds. And when she passed, because of her work over many decades, she was heralded as the mother of the Pell Grant program, having worked with Senator Claiborne Pell to make that program, to create it and to sustain it, and it's enabled 80 million Americans to reach college. So that's my mom. She was a badass. And then she went on to sit on 11 corporate boards and become a corporate executive. But she taught me what it was like to be one of the first and the only in a room that was not welcoming. My dad was born to the grandchildren, he was the grandson of slaves, born in South Carolina in 1920. And his grandfather had been a slave. He got a college education after slavery, went on to found a school in New Jersey called the Bordentown School, which for 70 years, from the late 1880s until the 1950s, educated generations of African Americans in vocational and technical skills and in college preparatory skills. And somehow this campus brought Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune and Albert Einstein.
Wow.
So my dad comes along in the 1920s, and it's the height of lynching and the height of Jim Crow, and he's trying to figure out, after his father and grandfather had gotten to college, how he was going to become anything. He ends up going to college in New York City, and then he gets drafted during World War II, and he serves at Tuskegee with the Tuskegee Airmen. And after college, and by the way, that experience, which we all look back on now and say, what a great, example of African American fighting and flying prowess. My dad was so bitter and pissed at the notion that African Americans had anything to prove to white people. The notion that we had to prove that we could fly and fight, and meanwhile serving in a segregated military where the battle was for the freedom of everybody but our own people. As patriotic as he was quite resentful of that. He tried to get a meal off the base, and he couldn't get served, but German POWs were being served in the same restaurants that were denying him. And so he leaves the war and goes to Berkeley and gets his PhD in economics in 1955. And as an African American, can't find a job on the West Coast because he's black. Not in business, not in government. He ends up getting his first job out of Berkeley at Cornell University as an assistant professor of economics, only because they didn't know until he showed up that he was black. And to their credit, they didn't put him out. And so he went on, he worked at the Treasury Department, the World Bank, and various other places, and ended up as a governor of the Federal Reserve. But his experience with race, and my mom's as well, of being pioneers in their fields, was incredibly impactful for me. And my dad, who dealt with the real psychological burden of segregation and the harshest form of prejudice, had a sort of epiphany in his mid-career, where he realized that he was never going to be able to fulfill his potential so long as he was carrying the psychological burden of other people's prejudice. And he realized that bigotry is, more than anything, the product of the bigot's own insecurity. And that as an African American, he had a choice. As many barriers as he would face, he had a choice about how he would think about himself. And he decided that he was not going to let other people's definition of him become his own. And so he had an expression. He had many expressions. One was, don't take crap off of anybody. Vicki's already pointed to that. But the other was, and this was in some ways more profound, if my being black is going to be a problem, it's going to be a problem for somebody else, not for me. In other words, I'm not going to let that be my burden. I'm going to do my best, do what I can on the basis of my own talents. And if people don't like it, that's their problem, which, as you will attest, is kind of how I handle myself.
All the time. But this is, I think, a good time to ask you what you would say to young people. Because we have a lot of young people here who are minorities, who are Hispanic or black, or we have a lot of foreign students here. And this is a difficult time. It's a divisive time. And they don't have to contend with the same prejudice you had to contend with.
I didn't with my parents more than me.
And they probably don't have the same sharp elbows, or as sharp. But what would you tell them about
I would say sharpen your elbows. But don't throw the first punch. Never throw the first punch. Yeah. But don't let yourself be pushed around or bullied. You've got to stand up for yourself. You've got to believe, even if you're doubting it, that you belong. You've got to believe that you've got the abilities and the talents, even if not the opportunities and the support to excel. And the guiding lesson that has served me well and that I try to to share with others is you cannot let other people define you for you. As soon as that happens, they look at you and they say you're a woman, or you're a person of color, or you're a lesbian, or gay, or disabled, or whatever it is, Muslim. They're putting you in a box. And you can either accept being in that box and allow that to infuse your own identity, your own sense of self, or you can say, no. No. They can think that about me, but I'm not going to let them make me think that about myself. And so it's like building muscles. Whether you're an athlete or a competitor in whatever it is, you have to build through practice the muscles. And this is about building the mental muscles of self-esteem. And you got to work at it over time. And you're going to have, setbacks and injuries and, failures. But building the mental muscles to believe that you belong and that you can is absolutely critical.
Yeah. I think that leads naturally to ask you, what was the one or the two moments in which were the most, you learned the most, or were the most difficult, or that, you had to overcome?
Well, first of all, my experiences were nothing compared to what my parents went through. I mean, by the time I came along, I was blessed to have a first-rate education, and parents who had a crappy marriage had no business ever being together, but they were there for me and my brother separately. So we had real support. But the experiences that I had, I think, that were most challenging were in the period, frankly, Vicki, where you and I worked together, where I was very young.
You didn't show it.
And inexperienced compared to my colleagues. And yet I had the responsibility, and it was one of these things I just described. I could either take on the perceived views of some of my colleagues that I didn't belong. I was too young. I was too inexperienced. Or I could recognize, look, I've got this job, and I've got two choices. I can do it to the best of my ability, or I can screw it up. And so I tried to do it to the best of my ability. And at this early stage of my professional career, in my early 30s, I had some tough lessons to learn. I thought that leadership was about setting a goal, having an objective, and driving towards it in a straight line as fast as you can get there. And I learned the hard way, particularly in this period in the wake of our embassy bombings, where people were, emotionally challenged. And by the way, it wasn't just that we had, as horrific as it was, our two embassies lost. We had a threat stream that persisted for almost a year, knowing that Al-Qaeda was casing and trying to bomb our embassies all over the continent. And we had, as some of you know, many facilities around the African continent. They were old construction, meaning they weren't built for blast, impact.
Yeah, like Nairobi.
They were closely, they were right up on the city streets. And so they were extremely vulnerable, and they were constantly being threatened. And we were constantly stressed out. And so one day, I don't know if you remember this, Vicki. We were working until late in the night, and we got threats to 40 of our 48 embassies, some crazy number of an imminent set of attacks the next day. And so I made a unilateral decision. I think it was a Thursday night going into a Friday.
I remember.
That we were going to shut down all of our embassies on the African continent for Friday and go through the weekend and then see where we were. And it was the right decision. The only problem was that I forgot to tell the Undersecretary of State that I'd shut down the African continent. And so the next morning, I get the most irate phone call from Ambassador Tom Pickering, who was the Undersecretary of State, saying, how the hell do you shut down the whole African continent and fail to inform the 7th floor of the State Department? I was like, my bad. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. Actually, I think that was your deputy's bad, because
my bad.
I had said, go ahead, but your other deputy, your principal deputy, Johnny, had said no. So Johnny and I were sort of fighting over this, and I think we didn't think about it.
But the point is, I should have called
You
Tom
were the
Pickering
boss.
and said, this is what we're doing. Instead, he had to read about it in the press. That was not a good morning.
I always thought that Rwanda had a huge impact on you. You were in Clinton's White House as a junior member of the national security team. And at that time, first you had Somalia, and then you had Rwanda. And of course, we didn't intervene in Rwanda, as you said, because nobody could even think about intervening in Rwanda at that point, because we had just lost our troops in Somalia, or not that long before. So did Rwanda, and maybe even Somalia, have a major impact on your thinking on Libya in particular, and maybe Syria as well, because you were the only one of Obama's advisors who told him to go ahead and retaliate by bombing some of the nuclear and missile sites. Chemical sites.
Not nuclear. So I was 28 when I started on the National Security Council staff, and I was responsible for the United Nations portfolio. Not yet working on Africa when Somalia and Rwanda occurred. So I was not a decision maker or even a person in a position to make recommendations on decisions, but I was an expert staffer with a front row seat on what happened in Somalia and Rwanda. And they did indeed, not just Somalia and Rwanda, but Haiti, remember the Harlan County?
I was there.
And Bosnia, all of these things were happening simultaneously. But as I write in the book, Somalia and Rwanda in particular were very formative experiences for me. From Somalia, I think what I learned in retrospect was the risk and the danger of a deployment of American forces into a combat zone, or we thought we were putting them into a humanitarian crisis, but turned into a combat zone. And with all of the things that were going on in the first year of President Clinton's term, which included Haiti and Bosnia and many other things, I think the senior cabinet level National Security Principles Committee, which many years later I came to chair as National Security Advisor, did not devote sufficient sustained attention to what was going on in Somalia and how the situation was evolving and deteriorating until it was too late. And so one of the key lessons was the need to be hands-on and attentive in that circumstance. The other was, you can't go into a completely foreign country with all of its complexity. I mean, if anybody knows anything about Somalia with its clan structure and its history, and it's like one of the most complex countries on the face of the earth. And we are like, going in to save lives and feed people, and that was the right thing to do. I don't disagree with it. But we didn't bother to try to learn about the country that we were going into. We had no idea just the complex machinations of that society, which came back to bite us. So that was also a lesson. And to add to that was, learning that Congress, when rarely they decide to intervene in foreign policy, can actually really constrain the hands of the executive branch. Rwanda occurred, the genocide began on April 6th, 7th of 1994, 7 days after the last American military forces had been ordered out of Somalia by Congress. And here we were in the midst of a crisis. We knew this part of the world had a history of, horrific ethnic killings. And we did what you were supposed to do every step of the way. You get your American personnel and as many foreigners out as you can safely. And, you do this and you do that. But we literally missed the forest for the trees. We were so busy trying to make each incremental decision correctly that we didn't confront the mega question, never confronted the mega question of whether the United States or the larger international community or African countries assisted by the United States or whatever permutation should intervene while the killing was going on to try to stop it. And I don't think it's a black and white question or answer as to whether that would have been the right decision or not. President Clinton thinks that we should have in retrospect. But the sin, in my judgment, was never calling the question. We never had a discussion or debate about whether or not to do this. And nobody in Congress was calling for it, and no editorial pages were calling for it. It was like we almost sleptwalked through genocide. And so what I learned from that is the critical importance of wrestling with these tough questions repeatedly and in real time. Doesn't mean you're going to get the answer right, but you can be sure you'll get it wrong if you don't address it. So when it came to Libya, where I was UN ambassador, not national security advisor, and Syria, where I was national security advisor, these were places where we were engaged and we had to make tough decisions. And my strong predisposition was to ensure that we were constantly calling the question. And we can argue about, whether we got it right or wrong, and I think in both cases, it's hard to argue that we got it right. We can argue about whether we ended up with the least bad outcome. Libya, just shorthand, as I say in the book, I think we did the right thing to intervene and we screwed up the aftermath. And when I say we, it's the United States, it's Europe, it's NATO, it's the UN, it's the Africans and the Arabs. But since we led the intervention, I believe to some extent you break it, you buy it. We didn't fix it. We didn't try to fix it. I don't know if we could have. Deborah, probably not. But we didn't try and we don't know. We didn't try soon enough, I guess is a way to put it. And then with Syria, much more complicated. I spend lots of time in the book on this. I won't bore you with it now. But the place where I dissented from all the other members of the national security team and from President Obama's ultimate decision was on the question of chemical weapons. This is 2013. You'll remember the red line. And the Syrian Assad used chemical weapons, killed almost 2,000 people. And the issue was not whether or not we ought to respond. The president decided we should respond militarily. The question was whether or not we should seek congressional authorization first. And President Obama, at the 10th, if not the 11th hour, made the decision that we ought to seek congressional authorization. And I argued that we shouldn't because, frankly, I didn't believe we'd get it. And long story short, we didn't get it. And my conclusion is that I was right about the politics, but actually wrong about the policy. Because had we bombed, as Trump did twice in 2017 and 2018, for about 24 hours, taking our target list off the shelf and using it, we would have had a couple nights of feel-good, but nothing would have changed. There's nothing that has changed since Trump bombed in 2017 and 2018. But in 2013, we used diplomacy and the threat of the use of force, long story short, to get 1,300 metric tons of chemical weapons out and destroyed. And that's, to me, it wasn't adequate because either they made some more or they kept some back. But I'll take 1,300 over 0 most days of the week.
And which just goes to show the Middle East is a quagmire. It seems as if no matter what you do in the Middle East, somebody turns it around or something happens. But I think in the case of Iran, in which Obama and you managed to negotiate, you were sort of in charge of watching it overwatching it, and Secretary Kerry was the man on the spot. You managed to complete this really landmark agreement of dismantling Iran's nuclear program. You changed the whole dynamic for the Middle East. And then President Trump dismantled it.
Well, so, yes, President Trump dismantled it. Yes. The Iran nuclear deal, which we concluded after 2+ years of diplomacy in 2015 effectively rolled back Iran's nuclear program and cut off all of its pathways, uranium, plutonium, covert, to a bomb, with great intrusive inspections and verifiable provisions, and it was working. It wasn't a deal that could have or purported to be a solution to all of Iran's bad behavior. It wasn't going to deal with the terrorism threat. It wasn't going to deal with missiles or human rights. But it was going and did put into a box the most dangerous part of Iran's capacity, which was sort of a force multiplier for its ability to do all these other bad things, and which the Israelis and our Gulf Arab allies had always claimed was their greatest concern. And then when we addressed that concern and resolved it, and by the way, for those who say, it was only going to be for a few years or whatever, that's not actually an accurate understanding of the deal. The deal would have prevented Iran from ever having a nuclear weapon. But the bottom line is, it was hated. The deal was hated by the Israelis and hated by the Saudis and the other Gulf Arabs. And when President Trump came in, having called it the worst deal ever, he put us on a path to undo it, and he did, and he put maximum sanctions on Iran, blah, blah, blah. Today, a deal which had been working, according to the U.S. Defense Department and intelligence community and IAEA, and had been abided by Iran, has now been blown up. And the Iranians are now back on the path with the amount of nuclear material that would enable them to build one bomb when they were well below that level. And their terrorism and their bad behavior and the region are all still major problems. So I count that as a huge upset and failure on the part of this administration.
And I agree, but I think particularly, too, the impact on our allies.
On our European allies.
Yeah.
Because we negotiated this deal in partnership with the European Union, the French, the Germans, the Brits, and actually also, which seems hard to believe now, with the Russians and the Chinese. We were all together in doing this. And when the U.S. walked away unilaterally, we didn't bring our partners with us. Our partners still think the deal is the best path, and they are, they've been desperately trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together. And they're very upset with the United States for abrogating our commitments.
Well, Secretary Mathis wrote about his concern that probably the worst thing that has so far occurred in the Trump administration is the denigration of our allies. Can your assessment of the Trump administration, or on just the Middle East, or in general? Was that a fair question?
It's a very fair question. I'm just trying to figure out how I can answer it in the time we have, and in a spirit that's in keeping with the evening. And a vocabulary. Yeah.
She has a good vocabulary in that regard.
I think there are many things to be said about the Trump administration's foreign policy, but let me just focus on a few. The notion that underlies, the purported notion that underlies the Trump administration's foreign policy of America first is obviously itself a flawed concept. We've never had a president of the United States, Democratic or Republican, who's ever sought to advance some other country's interest other than our own. It's always been about the United States and our interests and values. The differences have been about how do you advance our interests and values. And for years, up until the Trump administration, the view had been, for better or for worse, that we are more effective and more successful when we are doing it with partners and allies, when we're bringing others to join us. In the Obama administration, we brought others to join us to fight ISIS and build a coalition of over 70 countries. We brought the world together to advance the Paris Climate Agreement. We brought the world together to combat the Ebola epidemic and keep it from becoming a global pandemic. And I could go on, but with allies and partners, we were able to do much more than we could do on our own. In this administration, there seems to be a notion that everything is zero-sum. If it's good for us, it's got to be bad for somebody else. If it's good for them, it's got to be bad for us. And it doesn't matter if you're our ally or adversary. And by the way, if you're our allies, we're likely to be harder on you than if you're Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, or Xi Jinping or any number of other bad actors. But I actually think that as bad as America First is, as it's construed by this administration, where we denigrate our alliances and our best partners and elevate our adversaries, I actually think that that's not what's driving any of our policy, including our foreign policy. At the risk of being blunt and accused of being political, I think it's a me-first foreign policy. It is all about advancing the personal, political, and perhaps financial interests of one man and one family. And everything, whether it's how we respond to Russian interference, when we cut a trade deal with the Chinese after trademarks and benefits have been given to the Ivanka brand, or any number of other things that I could list. Turkey, it is not a foreign policy that is aligned with U.S. national interests and our values. And that is the fundamental problem with where we are today. And putting that back on track is going to be no small challenge.
Well, then I have to point out that you just endorsed Joe Biden.
I did just endorse Joe Biden on Monday.
Can he do it?
Hell yeah, he can do it. And he must, I don't know, can you hear now? Okay. No. So yeah, I endorsed Joe Biden on Monday. I hadn't made any endorsements up until this point in the campaign. And there are many reasons why I endorsed Joe Biden, having worked with him closely for 8 years. His decency, his empathy, his integrity, his competence, his experience, his relationship with our partners and allies around the world, which I think will enable us to begin a difficult task of rebuilding and repair from the point of maximum capacity. There's so many reasons why I think that, given the choices that we have, that he is far and away the best person that we, the Democrats, could put forward to defeat Donald Trump.
Well, Susan, you told me I wasn't going to get in all my questions, but I have 3.
Okay.
And I'm going to try to get them in. The first one is that when you were at the NSC, we had the outbreak of Ebola. And you just mentioned it, that we brought together our allies. But we also, and I think it was your idea, brought in the U.S. military. What should this administration, the Trump administration, be doing now to address Americans' fears about the coronavirus?
Well, let me hasten to say that there's many, many ways in which the Ebola virus differs from the coronavirus, and they're really kind of apples and oranges in the current context. We were able to largely isolate, contain, and roll back the Ebola virus in West Africa. And while we had a few cases that came to and through the United States, it was a different challenge and a different disease, much more deadly, but also much harder to contract. What we're dealing with now is actually more akin to something that many Americans have forgotten about entirely. The swine flu pandemic of 2009 that hit at the very beginning of the Obama administration. We were 4 months into the administration, and here we were faced with a swine flu pandemic that began in Mexico and secondarily in the United States and spread around the world. And the reason why so many people don't remember it, even though it was quite deadly, in retrospect, we believe 60 million Americans were infected. 12 and a half, when I say we, I mean the CDC. 12,500 Americans died. Some 300,000 were hospitalized. And around the world, hundreds of thousands died. But you all don't, have this perception of it as being a big deal in retrospect because, as President Obama likes to say, we handled our business. We dealt with it on the basis of science. We communicated calmly and rationally. We let the experts lead the way. We ramped up the effort to get treatments and vaccines in a timely fashion. And we didn't try to persuade the American people that it wasn't a problem, but we also didn't try to hype the concern. And so what we need now, frankly, is for the president to shut up and for Mike Pence, if he's going to run this thing, to let the experts drive the train and not muzzle them and not contradict them and not shade the truth. And they need to acknowledge, they have screwed this up royally. And that's not, gives me no joy to say it because it's going to affect all of us, right? This is not a joke, but it's not a moment for panic. But the reality is, we had an external strategy to deal with coronavirus. It's a problem over there, and we got to keep it from coming here. And they didn't recognize the obvious for any kind of flu-like, coronavirus-like pandemic, which is that you will have hotspots inevitably here in communities in the United States. And so by playing defense, rather than harnessing and using the time to build our capacity here to deal with the challenge we have and get the testing together and get the public health infrastructure readied, we lost precious time. And to this day, as Vice President Vice President Pence acknowledged today, we don't have the testing capacity. And so the truth is, we don't know how many coronavirus cases there are in the United States. There's certainly not 100. But having said that, the answer is facts, science, reason, calm, responsible leadership. And, we're starting from on the back foot, but it's not too late for all those things to be brought to bear.
Which we always saw with Obama and Susan Rice. I'll just make that as a statement rather than asking you about Obama's successes, because I have a final question. But before I ask the final question, the microphone's there if anybody wants to run up for questions and questions.
Don't knock over anything on your way to the microphone.
But I do have to ask this last question, because Susan, in her book, in the prologue, at the end, quotes Martin Luther King, which goes something like this, that the moral arc...
The arc of the moral universe
bends toward justice. Thank you, Susan. Does it?
The arc of the moral universe bends towards justice.
Does it?
That's the quote. What's the question?
Does it?
Well, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, yes, is what I believe. And by the way, that was the quotation woven into the carpet in the Oval Office when Barack Obama was president. However, it doesn't bend itself. We have to do the bending. And my purpose in using that quotation is to remind us that change happens when people make it happen. That we are agents. We are not passive bystanders. We all have a responsibility and an obligation to try to bend that arc in the direction we believe is right. And, you know, whether you're a young person trying to figure out how you want to devote your life energies, or just a regular citizen concerned about where we are and hopeful about where we can get to, we have to be engaged. We have to participate. We have to change the course of history and the course of that arc. So that's my closing message in Tough Love. And the other part of my closing message, because I speak in this last chapter of the book about the nature of our domestic political divisions and how severe they are, and how I think they actually constitute our greatest national security vulnerability. But I also call on people to recall our history and realize that we've been through periods of much worse division, from the Civil War to Reconstruction, to the backlash to Reconstruction and 2 world wars and McCarthyism, the Civil Rights era, Vietnam, Watergate. We've been through worse, and we've come through it unified and arguably stronger. But we have to be engaged and take action into our own hands. But I also say that if you look at history, nobody's ever won by betting against the capacity of the United States to renew itself, to grow and change. And I believe they'd be foolish to start now.
Yay. So we're going to take 2 questions at a time. So
2 at a time, that means I have to think.
you have to. I'll remember one, you
Okay.
remember the other.
Okay.
Okay. I have one question. When Trump is replaced, how do we regain the trust of the world?
Next question.
I have a question. Will you accept the vice presidential nomination when Joe Biden calls?
That second question I can dispense with quickly. The first one's a lot more complicated. I don't expect any phone calls in that regard, but pending my family's approval, I would accept that challenge, yes. On the first question, that's so challenging and so difficult. I think the most important thing for people to understand is, even in the context of the good news of electing a Joe Biden, if we could, there we go, it's going to take an extraordinary amount of time and patience to rebuild that trust and confidence. The reason is that our allies have come to question the truthfulness of what comes out of the White House. Our allies have come to question whether we're deeply committed to our alliance partnerships. And they've seen that not only do we have the capacity to elect a president one day who throws all of that to the wind, and the other day to replace him, what makes them think we won't come back to where we were today? So people are rattled. And the other thing that they are rattled by, frankly, is the failure of Congress to uphold its constitutional responsibilities as a co-equal branch. And the president's party in Congress has completely abdicated any responsibility for oversight or accountability. And that's really bad. But what's really bad about it is it's not just bad in this moment. It's going to be bad for a long time. What's going to make any future president? I mean, that's one good thing about Joe Biden. He understands the way things are supposed to be and still believes in the norms and the principles that have guided us. But what's to say 10 years from now, some president comes in, Democratic or Republican, and says, well, the hell with this. Trump didn't face any accountability. I don't need to provide a document or testimony to Congress despite a subpoena. To hell with Congress. And that precedent has been established. So we're going to need a lot of work and patience and humility to build back that trust. Joe Biden, in my view, is the right place to start, but we got to recognize it's going to take more than the term of any one new president or even 2 terms. This is a long-term hole we got to dig out of.
Next question.
First of all, I love that you're here. Thank you for coming. Given the divisions, I would love for you to speak to the divisions that are going on in the Democratic Party right now with the moderate versus the progressive, and what's, if you don't take the vice presidency, what
safe
sort
bet.
of vice president do you think would be a compliment to Joe Biden, given that we have to bring the Democratic Party together?
Thank you. Next question. I know you want to answer that.
Hi.
I have my orders.
As the mother of a very politically active 17-year-old girl, I know she thinks about this. I'm curious to know why you think we started out with such a diverse field of candidates and we've ended up with 2 white men.
We've ended up with 3 old white men. Okay, so you're remembering the first question.
Yeah.
I'm
President.
saddened by that too, quite honestly. We had an extraordinarily talented and diverse field, and I think maybe in part we had too many in the field, and people were challenged to coalesce early enough around a few. I think we're also dealing with people's risk aversion. And risk aversion in these moments in this country, in this time, sadly, I think, leads people to be even more fearful of people of color and women candidates as our standard bearer against this racist bully.
The other is vice
Misogynist racist bully.
The other is, who as vice president could bring the nation together?
Well, first of all, the top of the ticket matters enormously in that regard. And, the Democratic Party, I hope and pray, can and must come together at the end of this, regardless of who our nominee is, because the imperative is to, in my judgment, to defeat Donald Trump and to retain the House and hopefully pick up the Senate. And so leadership matters enormously. And I think that, there will need to be compromise and comedy forced and enforced on the top of our party, regardless of whether it's Sanders or Biden. But I think if Joe Biden were the nominee, the thing that might be most invigorating and energizing, in my personal opinion, would be a woman, and maybe particularly a woman of color.
Was that
A Stacey Abrams,
Stacey
a
or
Kamala
Susan?
Harris, or
Kamala?
hold on, I'm losing my mic.
Yeah, here it goes.
And/or a Latino or Latina. Those would be my wishes anyway.
Yeah, and I think that would help bring the party together, definitely. Okay, next question. Next two questions.
2 final questions, he's saying. He's looking very stern.
Next 2 final questions.
Okay.
Did we have a student
I don't really have
asking
a
a
question.
question,
Can you
by
hear
the
me?
way?
They're not up
Any
there.
students?
No, they're
Okay.
Closer? Okay.
Okay.
I don't really have a question. What I want to do, Ms. Rice, is to thank your mother, the mother of the Pell Grant. I was awarded a Pell Grant. My dad lost, I'm sorry for crying. My father lost his job at 48. We had a family, we had 5 kids, a set of twins. Both my parents worked. My dad was a middleman. He was chemist and a middle manager at a plastics company. And his father, who is 73 years old, developed gangrene in his leg in Arkansas. We lived in Chicago, and so he went back and forth, because my grandmother didn't drive, to take care of his dad and try and get things situated. And as a result of that, he lost his job, and he was 48, and it's not like it is now where you can get hired at 48 because you're valuable. But because of that, they didn't have any money for me to go to the Art Institute of Chicago, and I'd gone there as a kid on Saturday classes, and because of the Pell Grant, I was awarded that. And I just want to thank your mom. I'm 63 years old, and I'm a associate collections manager at the George O'Keeffe Museum. And so I want to thank your mother for that, and my mother. So
Thank you so much.
About 3 weeks ago, there was a op-ed piece by John Lehman, former Secretary of the Navy, in the Wall Street Journal, who essentially was saying that during the Obama administration, we had a bloated NSC staff of over 600 people, which essentially did not create the atmosphere of being able to move agilely in decision-making processes and having to do with, obviously, war and other things. He also stated that somehow President Trump had reduced that down to 50. The article's a little wavy on that. My question to you is, do you think a leaner NSC staff would serve whomever is president now and in the future better than a staff of 600?
Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I have not seen that op-ed, and I'm not certain whether you have the numbers correctly as it was published, but here's what I can tell you. The high watermark of this NSC staff came when I came on board as National Security Advisor. We had 400 NSC staff, never 600. It's never been near that number. That 400 included those that were professional policy staff, those that were dual-hatted with the National Economic Council staff that did international economics, those who had been incorporated from what had been under President Bush, the former Homeland Security Council staff, plus administrative support, plus computer and systems support, plus all the people who run the White House Situation Room on 3 24-hour shifts. So the actual policy staff, as opposed to support staff, was about 200, and the support functions all in were about another 200 under my tenure. When I came to the NSC, I had the benefit of having 20 years earlier worked on the NSC staff. This is back when I described I was 28 years old, 30 years old, under President Clinton, when the staff was substantially leaner, about 150 to 200. And so my bias coming in was to think that we had gotten too big. And I wanted to carefully and deliberately, after having taken over responsibility for the staff and seeing how it functioned, I didn't do it on day one or week one. I looked at how we were operating and tried to, what I called, right-size the NSC staff, where I thought there was bloat, to trim it, where I thought we were understaffed, to reinforce. And so I, by the end of my tenure, reduced the NSC staff thoughtfully and deliberately by 15%, without ever throwing anybody out on the street, and I did it by attrition and very rationally, and without regard for whether somebody was a political appointee or a career employee. I can assure you that President Trump's National Security Council staff is not now 50 people. That is also inaccurate, because all those support people are still there, all 200 of them. When they talk about trimming the staff, they're talking about trimming the policy staff, which, when I left, was about 150 as opposed to 200. And I can also assure you they have not yet trimmed that 150 to 50. But when they do, I can tell you from experience, they will have cut well into bone. And that bone is what is supposed to be there to run a process that protects us. One of the offices which I created in my tenure, even in the context of shrinking the staff and right-sizing, was to create an office of global health security to deal with exactly what we're dealing with today. When John Bolton came in, he fired Admiral Ziemer, who was a very respected and knowledgeable Coast Guard guy who'd run infectious diseases, fired him and cleared out the entire team. And one of the reasons why we are so flat-footed today is because they were unprepared. They did not have the capacity inside the White House to recognize the threat when it arose and to coordinate and lead the policy effort to fix it. So this is not as simple as large or small. It's how we allocate resources and whether they are deployed towards the things that we need most in the 21st century. And so I'm quite proud of the NSC staff I led. I'm not here to say that it couldn't be trimmed further, but I think that where we are now has been driven by the president's antipathy to career employees, and we have cut into bone, and we are paying the price.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for being here. What a great discussion. Thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about. And read the book.
Let's thank Ambassador Rice and Ambassador Huddleston for a great conversation.